All right, guys, we're on to book 5 of the Iliad, Chapman's Homer's reading. And in book 5, the theme is going to inspire Diomedes of the Greeks to sort of set about a rampage in the middle of battle. He's going to come into an interlocutor with Pandarus and Aeneas. Aphrodite is going to join Aeneas' side in protecting him. And eventually, we're going to see Diomedes' exploits get proclaimed up to the level where he deems himself worthy to take on the gods. And so without further ado, here is Chapman's introduction, or argument. King Diomed by Pallas' spirit inspired, with will and power, is for his acts admired. Mere men, and men derived from deities, and deities themselves he terrifies. Adds wounds to terrors his inflamed lance, draws blood from Mars and Venus. In a trance, he casts Aeneas with a weighty stone. Apollo quickens him and gets him gone. Mars was recured by Paeon, but by Jove rebuked for authoring breach of human love. In Epsilon, heaven's blood is shed by sacred rage of Diomed. Then Pallas breathed in Tydeus' son to render whom supreme. To all the Greeks at all his parts she cast a hotter beam. On his high mind, his body filled with much superior might, and made his complete armor cast a far more complete light. From his bright helm and shield did burn a most unwearied fire, like rich Autumnus' golden lamp, whose brightness men admire, past all the other hosts of stars, when with his cheerful face, fresh washed in lofty ocean waves, he doth the skies and chase, to let whose glory lose no sight. Still Pallas made him turn where tumult most expressed his power, and where the fight did burn. An honest and a wealthy man inhabited in Troy, Dares, the priest of Mulciber, who 2 sons did enjoy, Idaeus and bold Phegeus. Well seen in every fight, these single from their troops and horse assailed Minerva's knight, who ranged from fight to fight on foot, all hasting mutual charge, and now drawn near, first Phegeus threw a javelin swift and large. With head whose the king's left shoulder took, but did no harm at all. Then rushed he out a lance at him, and that had no idle fall, but in his breast struck twixt the paps, and struck him from his horse. Which stern sight when Idaeus saw, distrustful of his force, to save his slaughter's brother's spoil, it might him headlong leap from his fair chariot and leave all. Yet had not scaped the heap of heaven funeral, if the god, great president of fire, had not in sudden clouds of smoke and pity of his sire, to leave him utterly unaired, given safe pass to his feet. He gone, Tydeus sent his horse to chariot to the fleet. The Trojan, seeing Dares' son, one slain, the other fled, was struck and amazed, blue-eyed maid to grace a Diomed, in giving free way to his power, made this so ruthful fact a fit advantage to remove the war god out of act, who raged so on the Ilion side. She gripped his hand and said, Mars, Mars, thou ruiner of men, that in the dust hast laid most so many cities, with blood thy godhead dost stain. Now shall we cease to show our breast as passionate as men, and leave the mixture of our lands, resigning Jove his right, as rector of the gods, to give the glory of the fight. Where he affecteth, lest he force what he should freely yield, he held it fit, and went with her from the tumultuous field, who set him in an herby seat on broad Scamander's shore. He gone, all Troy was gone with him, the Greeks drave all before, and every leader slew a man, but first the king of men deserved the honour of his name, and led the slaughter then. In slew a leader, one more huge than any man he led, great Odius, Duke of Halizons. Quite from his chariot's head he struck him with a lance to earth. First he flight addressed. He took his forward, turned back, and looked out of his breast. His huge trunk sounded, and his arms did echo the resound. Idomeneus to the death did noble Thetis wound, the son of Maeon Borus, that from cloddy Turner came, who taking chariot took his wound, and tumbled with the same. From his attempted seat the lance through his right shoulder struck. A horrid darkness struck him through. The spoil his shoulders took. Atrides Menelaus slew, as he before him fled, Scamandrius, son of Strophius, that was a huntsman bred, a skilful huntsman, for his skill Diana's self did teach, and made him able with his dart infallibly to reach all sorts of subtlest savages, each which many a woody hill bred for him, and he much preserved, and all to show his skill. Yet not the dart delighting queen taught him to shun his dart, nor all his hitting so far off, the mastery of his art. His back received it, and he fell upon his breast withal. His body's ruin and his arms so founded in his fall, that his affrighted horse flew off, and left him like his life. Meriones slew Phericlus, whom she that ne'er his wife, yet goddesses of good housewives, held in excellent respect for knowing all the witty things that grace an architect, of having power to give it all, the cunning use of hand. Hermonides, his sire, built ships and made him understand, with all the practice it required, the frame of all that skill. He built all Alexander's ships, that authored all the ill of all the Trojans and his own, because he did not know the oracles advising Troy, for fear of overthrow, to meddle with no sea affair, but live by tilling land. This man Meriones surprised and drave his deadly hand through his right hip. The lance had run through the region. About the bladder underneath, in muscles and the bone, he sighing bowed his knees to death and sacrificed to earth. Phylides stayed in piteous flight Antenor's bastard birth, whom virtuous Theano his wife to please her husband kept, as tenderly as those she loved. Phylides near him stepped, and in the fountain of the nerves did reach his fervent lance. At his head back part, and so far the sharp head did advance, it cleft the organ of his speech, and iron cold as death. He took betwixt his grinning teeth, and gave the air his breath. Eurypylus, the much renowned and great Evamon's son, divine Hypsenor slew, begot by stout Dolopion. And to consecrate Scamander's priest, he had a god's regard amongst the people. His hard flight to Grecian followed hard, rushed in so close, that with his sword he on his soldier laid. A blow that his arm's brawn cut off, nor there his vigour stayed, he drove down, and from off his wrist it slew his holy hand, that gushed out blood, and down it dropped upon the bushing sand. Death, with his purple finger, shut the violent fate his eyes. Thus fought these, but distinguished well, Diomedes so implies his fury, that you could not know whose side had interest in his free labours, Greece or Troy, but as a flood increased by violent and sudden showers let down from hills, like hills melted in fury swells and foams, so he overfills his natural channel, that besides both hedge and bridge resigns, to his rough confluence far spread, and lusty flourishing vines. Drowned in his outrage, Tydeus' son so overran the field, strewed with such as flourished in his way, and made whole squadrons yield, when Pandarus, Lycaon's son, beheld his ruining hand, with such resistless insolence make lanes through every band, he bent his gold-tipped bow of horn, and shot through rushing in. At his right shoulder, where his arms were hollow, forth did spin the blood. Down his currents ran, when Pandarus cried out, "Rank riding Trojans, now rush in. Now, I make no doubt. Our bravest foe is marked for death, he cannot long sustain. My violent shaft, if Jove's fair son did worthily constrain my foot from Lycia." Thus he braved, and yet his violent shaft struck short. With all his violence, Tydides' life was salved, who yet withdrew himself behind his chariot and steeds, and called so Sthenelus, "Come, friend, my wounded shoulder needs thy hand to ease it of his shaft." He hastened from his seat before the coach, and drew the shaft. The purple wound did sweat, and drowned his shirt of mail and blood, and as it bled he prayed, "Hear me, of Jove, Aegiacus, thou most unconquered maid, if ever in the cruel field thou hast assistful stood, or to my father or myself now love to do me good. Give him into my lance's reach, that thus hath given a wound. To him thou guardst, preventing me, and brags that nevermore I shall behold the cheerful sun." Thus did the king implore. The goddess heard come near, and took the weariness of flight from all the nerves and lineaments, and made them fresh and light, and said, "Be bold, O Diomed, in every combat shine. The great shield shaker, Tydeus' strength, the knight that sire of thine, by my infusion breathes in thee, and from thy knowing mind I have removed those erring mists that made it lately blind, that thou madest different gods from men, and therefore use thy skill against the tempting deities, if any have a will, to try if thou presumest of that as thine that flows from them, and so assumed above thy right, where thou discernst a beam of any other heavenly power, that she that rules in love, that calls thee to the change of blows, resist not, but remove. But if that goddess be so bold, since she first stirred this war, assault and mark her from the rest with some infamous scar." The blue-eyed goddess vanished, and he was seen again Amongst the foremost who before through he were prompt and fain to fight against the Trojan powers, now in his spirits were called with thrice the vigour and lion-like that hath been lately galled by some bold shepherd in a field where his curled flocks were laid, who took him as he leaped the fold, not slain yet, but depaid. With greater spirit comes again, and then the shepherd hides, rather of the desolate place, and in his cot abides, his flock left guardless, which amazed shake and shrink up in heaps. He ruthless freely takes his prey, and out again he leaps, so sprightly, fierce, victorious, the great hero flew upon the Trojans, and at once he two commanders slew, Hippenor and Istinus. In one his lance he fixed, full at the nipple of his breast, the other smote betwixt the neck and shoulder with his sword, which was so well laid on, it swept his arms and shoulder off. These left he rushed upon Abas and Pallades of old Eurydamas, the hapless sons who could by dreams tell what could come to pass. Yet when his sons set forth to Troy, the old man could not read by their dreams that would chance for them. Both were stricken dead by great Diomedes. After these, he takes into his rage Xanthus and Thoon, Phaenops' son, born to him in his age, the good old man, even pinned with years, with one so more. There's goods, yet Diomedes took both and left him store, tears and sorrows in their steads, since he could never see his sons leave those hot wars alive. So this the end must be of all his labours, that he heaped to make his issue great, authority aired, and with her seed filled his forgotten seat. Then snatched he up two Priamists, that in one chariot stood, Echemon and fair Chromius, as feeding in a wood oxen or steers are, one of which a lion leaps upon, tears down, and wrings in two his neck. So sternly Tydeus' son threw from their chariot both these heaps of old Diomedes, then took their arms and sent their horse to those that ride the seas. Aeneas, seeing the troops thus tossed break through the heat of flight and all the whizzing of the darts to find the Lycian knight, Lycaon's son, whom having found he thus bespake the pair, O Pandarus, where's now thy bow? Thy deathful arrows where, in which no one in all our host but gives the palm to thee, nor in the sun-loved Lycian greens that breathe our archery lives any that exceeds thyself. Come with thy hands to Jove. Send an arrow to this man, but if it prove the wins such godlike victories, and now affects our host with so much sorrow, since so much of our best blood is lost by his high valour, I have fear some god in him doth threat, incensed for want of sacrifice, the wrath of gods is great. Lycaon's famous son replied, Great counsellor of Troy, this man so excellent in arms I think is Tydeus' joy. I know him by his fiery shield, by his bright three-plumed casque, and by his horse, nor can I say if or some god doth mask in his appearance, or he be whom I am named Tydeus' son, but without God the things he does for certain are not done. Some great immortal that conveys his shoulders in a cloud goes by and puts by every dart at his bold breast bestowed, or lets it take with little hurt, for I myself let fly a shaft that shot him through his arms, but had as good gone by, yet which I gloriously affirmed had driven him down to hell. Some god is angry, and with me, for far hence where I dwell, my horse and chariots idle stand, with which some other way I might repair this shameful miss, even fair chariots stay in old Lycaon's court, new made, new trim, to have been gone, curtained and harassed underfoot, 2 horse in every one, that eat white barley and black oats, and do no good at all, and these Lycaon, that well knew how these fares would fall, charged when I set down this design, I should command with here, and gave me manly lessons more, all which much better were than I took forth myself. The reason I laid down was but the sparing of my horse, since in a sieged town I thought our horse meat would be scant, when they were used to have their manger full. So I left them, and like a lackey slave, am come to Ilion, confident in nothing but my bow. That nothing profits me, 2 shafts I vainly did bestow at 2 great princes, but of both my arrows neither slew, nor this, nor Atreus' younger son. A little blow I drew, that served but to incense them more in an unhappy star. I therefore from my armoury have drawn these tools of war, that today, when, for great Hector's sake, to amiable Troy, I came to lead the Trojan bands, but if I ever joy in safe return to my country, sight my wife's, my lofty towers, let any stranger take his head, if to the fiery powers this bow, these shafts, in pierce burst, by these hands be not thrown, idle companions that they are to me. and to my renown. Aeneas said, Use no such words, for any other way than this they shall not be now used. We first will both essay this man with horse and chariot. Come then, ascend to me, that thou mayst try our Trojan horse, how skilled in field they be, and in pursuing those that fly or flying be pursued. How excellent they are of foot, and these, if Jove conclude the escape of Tydeus again, and grace him with our flight, shall serve to bring us safely off. Come, I'll be first, shall flight. Take thou these fair reins, and this scourge, or if thou wilt, fight thou, and leave the horse's care to me. He answered, I will now descend, fight, and keep the reins, and guide thyself thy horse, who with their wonted manager will better wield the force of the impulsive chariot, if we be driven to fly. Then with a stranger under whom they will be much more shy, and fearing my voice, wishing thine, grow resty, nor go on, to bear us off, but leave engaged for mighty Tydeus' son, themselves and us. Then be they part, thy one-hoofed horse's guide, I'll make the fight, and with a dart receive us with pride. This the gorgeous chariot both thus prepared ascend, and make full way at Diomedes, which noted by his friend, my own most loved mind, said he, Two mighty men of war I see come with a purpose charge. One's he that hits so far with bow and shaft, Lycaon's son, the other fame's the brood of great Anchises, and the queen that rules in amorous blood, Aeneas. Excellent in arms, come up to use your steeds, and look not war so in the face, lest that desire that feeds the great mind be the bane of it. This did the anger sting, the blood of Diomedes, to see his friend that chid the king before the fight, and then preferred his ablest and his mind to all his ancestors in fight, now come so far behind, whom thus he answered. Urge no flight, it cannot please me so, nor is it honest in my mind to fear a coming foe, or make a flight good through with fight. My powers are yet entire, and scorn the help tire of a horse. I will not blow the fire of their hot valours with my flight, but cast upon the blaze. This body borne upon my knees I entertain amaze. Minerva will not see that shame, and since they have begun, they shall not both elect their ends, and he that escapes shall run, or stay and take the other's fate, and this I leave for thee. If amply wise Athenia give both their lives to me, rein our horse to their chariot hard, and have a special heed, to seize upon Aeneas' steeds, that we may change their breed, and make a Grecian race of them that have long been of Troy. For these are bred of those brave beasts, which for the lovely boy that waits now on the cup of Jove, Jove that far-seeing God, gave Tros the king in recompense, the best that ever trod, the sounding centre underneath the morning and the sun. Anchises stole the breed of them, for where their sides did run, he closely put his mares to them, and never made it known to him that aired them, who was then the king of Laomedon. 6 horses had he of that race, of which himself kept 4, and gave the other to his son, and there that they should score the field so bravely towards us, expert in charge and flight. If these we have the power to take, our prize is exquisite, and our renown will far exceed. While these were talking thus, the 3rd horse brought the assailants near, and thus spake Pandarus. Most suffering-minded Tydeus' son, that hast of war the art, my shaft that struck thee slew thee not, I now will prove a dart. This said, he shook, and then he threw a lance aloft and large, that in Tydeus' curate stuck, quite driving through his targe. Then brayed he out so wild a voice that all the field might hear, Now have I reached thy root of life, and by the death shall bear our praises chief prize from the field. Tydeus, undismayed, replied, Thou errest, I am not touched, but more charge will be laid to both your lives before you part. At least the life of one shall satiate the throat of Mars. That said, his lance was gone. Minerva led it to the face, which at his eye ran in, and as he stooped, struck through his jaw, his tongue's root and his chin. Down from the chariot he fell, his gay arms shinned and wrung. The swift horse trembled, and his soul forever charmed his tongue. Aeneas, with his shield and lance, leapt swiftly to his friend, afraid the Greeks would force his trunk, and that he did defend. Bold as a lion of his strength, he hid him from his shield, shook round his lance, and horribly did threaten all the field with death, if any dearth make in. Tydeus raised a stone with his one hand of wondrous weight, and poured it mainly on the hip of Ancasariades, wherein the joint doth move, the thigh, 'tis called the huckle-bone, which all insureds did drove, break both the nerves, and with the edge cut all the flesh away. It staggered him up upon his knees, and made the hero say, his struck blind temples in his hand, his elbow on the earth, and there this prince of men had died, if she that gave him birth, kissed by Anchises on the green, where his fair oxen fed, Jove's loving daughter, instantly had not about him spread her soft embraces, and conveyed within her heavenly veil, used as a rampires against all darts that did so hot assail, her dear-loved issue from the field, thus Sthenelus in haste, remembering what his friend advised, from forth the praise made fast his own horse to their chariot, and presently laid hand upon the lovely coated horse Aeneas did command, which bringing to the wandering Greeks, he did their guard commend to his beloved Deipylus, who was his inward friend, and of his equals one to whom he had most honour shown, that he might see them safe at fleet. Then stepped he to his own, with which he cheerfully made into Tydeus' mighty race. He, mad with his greatest enemy's rape, was hot in desperate chase of her that made it with his lance, armed less with steel in spite, well knowing her no deity that had no due in fight. Minerva, his great patroness, nor she that raceth towns, Bellona, but a goddess weak and foe to men's renowns. Her through a world of fight pursued, at last he overtook, and thrusting up with his ruthless lance, her heavenly veil he struck, that even the graces wrought themselves at her divine command, quite through, and hurt the tender back of her delicious hand, the rude point piercing through the palm. Forth flowed the immortal blood. Blood, such as flowed in blessed gods that eat no human food, nor drink or inflaming wine, and therefore bloodless are, and called immortals. Out she cried, could no longer bear her loved son, whom she cast from her in a sable cloud. Phoebus receiving hid him close from all the Grecian crowd, lest some of them should find his death. Away flew Venus then, and after her cried Diomedes, away thou spoil of men, thou sprung from all-preserving Jove, these hot encounters leave. It's not enough that silly dames thy sorceries should deceive, unless thou thrust into the war and rob a soldier's right. I think a few of these assaults will make thee fear the fight. Wherever thou shalt hear it named, she sighing went her way, extremely grieved, and with her griefs her beauties did decay. And black her ivory body grew, then from a dewy mist brake swift-foot Iris to her aid. From all the darts that hissed at her quick rapture, and to Mars they took their plaintive course, and found him on the fight's left hand, by him his speedy horse, and huge lance lying in a fog. The queen of all things fair, her loved brother on her knees besought with instant prayer his golden ribbon-bound manned horse to lend her up to heaven. For she was much grieved with a wound a mortal man had given. Tydeus, that against Jove himself durst now advance his arm, he granted, and his chariot perplexed with her late harm. She mounted, and her wagoness was she that paints the air. The horse she reined, and with a scourge importuned their repair, that of themselves flew out the wind, and quickly they ascend Olympus high, the seat of gods. The horse knew their journey's end, stood still, and from their chariot the windy-footed dame dissolved, and gave them heavenly food, and to Dione came. Her wounded daughter bent her knees. She kindly bade her stand, with sweet embraces helped her up, and stroked her with her soft hand, called kindly by her name, and asked, what God hath been so rude, sweet daughter, to chastise thee thus, as if thou wert pursued even to the act of some light sin, and deprehended so, for otherwise each close escape is in the great let go. She answered, haughty Tydeus' son hath been so insolent, since with him most my heart esteems of all my love descent. I rescued from his bloody hand, now battle is not given to any Trojans by the Greeks, but by the Greeks to heaven. She answered, daughter, think not much. Through much grieve thee, use thy patience, whereof many gods examples may produce. Many bitter ills received, as well that men sustain, that their inflictions as by men repay to them again. Mars suffered much more than thyself by Ephialtes' power. Anotus, Aloeus' son, who in a brazen tower and inextricable chains cast that war-greedy god, where twice 6 months and one he lived, and there the period of his sad life perhaps had closed, if his kind stepdame's eye, fair Erebea, had not seen, who told it Mercury he by stealth enfranchised him, though he could scarce enjoy the benefit of franchisement. The chains did so destroy his vital forces with their weight, so Juno suffered more, when with a 3-forked arrow's head Amphitryos' son did gore her right breast. Past all hope of cure, Pluto sustained no less by that self-man, and by a shaft of equal bitterness, shot through his shoulder at hell gates, and there amongst the dead, were he not deathless, he had died, but up to heaven he fled, extremely tortured, for a cure, which instantly he won at Paeon's hand with sovereign balm, and this did Jove's great son, unblessed, great high-deed, daring man, nor cared, nor doing ill, with his bow durst wound the gods, but by Minerva's will, thy wound the foolish Diomedes was so profane to give, not knowing thee, the fights with heaven, hath never long to live. And for his deed he never shall have child about his knee, to call him father coming home. Besides he hear this from me, strength trusting man, that though thou be strong, and art and strength a tower, take heed a stronger meet thee not, and that a woman's power contains not that superior strength, unless that woman be Adrastus' daughter, and thy wife, the wise Aegiale. When from this honour, this hour not far, she wakes, even sighing with desire, to kindle our revenge on thee with her enamouring fire, in choosing her some fresh young friend, and so drowned all thy fame, won here in war, in her court, and in an opener shame. This said, with both her hands she cleansed the tender back and palm of all the sacred blood they lost, and never using balm, the pain ceased. The wound was cured of this queen, this kind queen of love. Juno and Pallas, seeing this, essayed to anger Jove, and quit his late made mirth with them about the loving dame. Some sharp jest in like sort, built upon her present shame, grey-eyed Athenia began, and asked the Thunderer, if nothing moving him to wrath, she boldly might prefer what she conceived to his conceit, and staying no reply, she bade him in view the Cyprian fruit he loved so tenderly, whom she thought hurt, and by this means intending to suborn some other lady of the Greeks whom lovely veils adorn, to gratify some other friend of her much loved Troy, as she embraced and stirred her blood to the Venerian joy, the golden clasp those Grecian dames upon their girdles wear, took hold of her delicious hand, and hurt it she had fear. The thundered smiled, and called to him love's golden arbitress, and told her those rough works of war were not of for her access. She should be making marriages, embracings, kissings, charms. Stern Mars and Pallas had the charge of those affairs in arms. While these thus talked, Tydides' rage still thirsted to achieve his prize upon Anchises' son, though well he did perceive the sun himself protected him. But his desires inflamed with that great Trojan prince's blood, and arms so highly famed. Not that the great god did reverence, thrice rushed he rudely on, and thrice betwixt his darts and death the sun's bright target shone. But when upon the fourth assault, much like a spirit he flew, the far-off working deity exceeding wrathful grew, and asked him, what, not yield to gods, thy equal learn to know? The race of gods is far above the men creeping here below. This drave him on to some small retreat. He would not tempt more near the wrath of him that struck so far, whose power had now set clear. Aeneas from the stormy field within the holy place of Pergamus, where to the hope of so sovereign grace a goodly temple was advanced, in whose large inmost part he left him, and to his supply inclined his mother's heart, Latona, and the dart-pleased queen, who cured and made him strong. The silver-bowed fair god then threw in the tumultuous throng an image that in stature, luck, and arms did create like Venus' son, for which the Greeks and Trojans made debate, laid loud strokes on their ox-hide shields and bucklers easily borne, which e'er Phoebus pleased the urged on Mars himself in scorn. Mars, Mars, said he, a plague of men smeared with the dust and blood, of humans of their ruined walls, yet thinks the godhead God. The fright this fury from the field, who next will fight with Jove. First in a bold approach he hurt, then most palm of thy love. And next, as if he did affect to have a deity's power, he held out his assault on me. This said, from the lofty tower of Pergamus, he made his seat, and Mars did now excite the Trojan forces in the form of him that led to fight the Thracian troop, swift Acamas. Of Priam's son, said he, how long the slaughter of your men can ye sustain to see, even till they brave you at your gates, ye suffer beaten down Aeneas, great Anchises' son, whose prowess woe renowned, as much as Hector's, fetch him off from this contentious prease. With this, the strength and spirits of all the courage did increase, and yet Sarpedon seconds him with his particular taunt of noble Hector. Hector, where is thy unthankful vaunt? And that huge strength on which it built, that thou and thy allies, and with all the brothers, and without aid of us or of our supplies, and troubling not a citizen, a city safe withhold. In all which friends that brothers helps I see not nor am told of any one of their exploits, but all held in dismay of Diomedes, like a sort of dogs at a lion bay. And entertain no spirit to pinch, we, your assistants here, to fight for the town, as you helped us, and I, an aiding peer, no citizen even out of care that doth become a man, for men and children's liberties add all the aid I can, not out of my particular cause, for hence my profit grows, for far hence Asian Lycia lies where gulfy Xanthus flows. And where my loved life infant son and treasured nothing scant, I left behind me, which I see those men would have that want, and therefore they that would have cape. Yet I, as I would lose their sure fruition, cheer my troops, and with their lives propose mine own life, both to general fight and to particular cope with this great soldier, though I say I entertain no hope to have such gettings as the Greeks, nor fear to lose like Troy. Yet thou, even Hector, deedless standst, and carest not to employ thy town-born friends to bid them stand to fight and save their wives, lest as a fowler casts his nets upon the silly lives of birds and of all sorts, so the foe your walls and houses hails, one with another on all heads, or such escape their falls. He made the prey and prize of them as willing overthrown, that hope not for you with their force, and so with this brave-built town will prove a chaos. It deserves in thee so hard a care, as should consume the days and nights to hearten and prepare the assistant princes, pray their minds to bear their far-brought toils, to give them worth with worthy fight, in victories and foils, still to be equal, and thyself, exempling them in all, need no reproofs nor spurs, all this in thy free choice should fall. This stung great Hector's heart, and yet as every generous mind should silent bear a just reproof, and show what good they find in worthy counsels by their ends, but in present deeds, not stomach nor vainly shamed. So Hector's spirit proceeds, and from his chariot, whom wholly armed, he jumped upon the sand. On Photso toiling through the host, a dart in either hand. And all hands turned against the Greeks despised their worst, and thickening their instructed powers, expected all they durst, were then, with the feet of horse and foot, the dust and clouds did rise, and as in sacred floors of barns upon the corn winnowers flies the chaff, driven with an opposite wind, when yellow Ceres dites, which all the diters' feet, legs, arms, their heads and shoulders white, so looked the Grecians grey with dust that struck the solid heaven, raised from returning chariots, and troops together driven, each side stood to their labours firm. Fierce Mars flew through the air, and gathered darkness from the flight, and with his best affair obeyed the pleasure of the sun, that wears the golden sword, who bade him raise the spirits of Troy when Pallas ceased to ford her helping offers to the Greeks, and then his own hands wrought, which from his fane's rich counsel curd the true Aeneas brought, and placed him by his peers in field, who did the joy admire, to see him both alive and safe in all his powers entire, yet stood not sifting how it chanced, another sort of task. Then stirring the idle sieve of news, did all their forces ask, inflamed by Phoebus, harmful Mars, and Eris eager afar. The Greeks had none to hearten them, their hearts rose with the war, but chiefly Diomed, Ithacus, and both the Ajaxes used stirring examples and good words. Their own fames had infused spirit enough into their bloods to make them neither fear the Trojans' force nor fate itself. But still expecting war, when most was done, what would be more? Their ground they still made good, and in their silence set the powers like fair still clouds they stood, with which Jove crowns the top of hills in any quiet day, when Boreas and the ruder winds that used to drive away air's dusky vapours, being loose in many a whistling gale, are pleasingly bound up and calm, and not a breath exhale. So firmly stood the Greeks, nor fled for all the Ilians' aid. Atrides yet coasts through the troops, confirming men so stayed. "O friends," said he, "hold up your minds. Strength is but strength of will. Reverence each other's good, and fight and shame of all things done ill. While soldiers show an honest shame, and love of honor lives, the ranks men with the first in fight, death fewer liveries gives than life, or than where fame's neglect makes cowards fight at length. Flight neither doth the body grace, nor shows the mind hath strength," he said, with swiftly through the croups a mortal lance did send, that reft a standard-bearer's life, renowned Aeneas' friend, Deacon Pergasides, whom all the Trojans loved. As he, while one of Priam's sons, his mind was so approved, in always fighting with first. The lance his target took, which could not interrupt the blow that through it clearly struck, and in his belly's rim was sheathed. Beneath his girdle stead he sounded falling, and his arms with him resounded dead. Then fell two princes of the Greeks by great Aeneas' ire, Diocles' sons, Orsilochus and Creton, whose kind sire in bravely built Ephyra dwelt, rich and of sacred blood. He was descended lineally from great Alpheus' flood, but broadly flows through Pelis' fields. Alpheus did beget Orsilochus, who on the rule of many men was set, and that Orsilochus begat the rich of Diocles. Diocles sired the Cretan was, and this Orsilochus. Both these arrived at man's estate, and both to Triadas went, to honour them in Tylian war, but both were one day sent to death as well as Troy. For death hid both in one black hour, as two young lions with their dams sustained but to devour, bred on the tops of some steep hill, and in some gloomy deep of an inaccessible wood, rush out and prey on sheep, steers, oxen, destroys men's stalls, so long that they come short, and by the owners steal are slain, such unhappy sort. Fell these beneath Aeneas' power, when Menelaus viewed like two tall fir trees, these two fall, their timeless falls he rued, and to the first fight, while they lay, a vengeful force he took, his arms beat back, the sun in flames, a dreadful lance he shook. Mars put the fury in his mind, that by Aeneas' hands, he who was to make no slaughter good, he might have strode the sands. Antilochus, old Nestor's son, observing he was bent to urge a combat of such odds, and knowing the event, being ill on his parts all their pains, alone sustained for him, erred from their end, made after hard, and took them in the trim of an encounter. Both their hands and darts advanced and shook, and both pitched in full stance of charge, when suddenly the look of Anchises took note of Nestor's valiant son, in full charge too, which 2-to-1 made Venus' issue shun the hot adventure, though he were a soldier well approved. Then drew they off their slaughtered friends, who given to their beloved, they turned where fight showed deadliest hate, and there mixed with the dead Palemon, that the targeteers of Paphlagonia led, a man like Mars, and with him fell good Medon, that did guide his chariot. Atimnus' son, the prince Palemon, died by Menelaus. Nestor's joy slew Medon, one before, the other in the chariot. Atrides' lance did gore Palemon's shoulder and the blade. Antilochus' force, mighty stone up from the earth, and as he turned his horse, struck Medon's elbow in the mist. The reins of ivory fell from his hands into the dust. Antilochus let fly his sword withal, and rushing in, a bow so steadily laid upon his temples that he groaned, and tumbled to earth, and stayed a mighty while preposterously, because the dust was deep upon his neck and shoulders there, even till his foe took keep of his prized horse, and made them stir, and then he prostrate fell. His horse Antilochus took home, when Hector had heard tell amongst the uproar of their deaths, he laid out all his voice and ran upon the Greeks. Behind came many men of choice. Before him marched great Mars, himself marched with his female mate, the dread Bellona. She brought on to fight for mutual fate a tumult that was wild and mad. He took a horrid lance, and now led Hector and anon behind would make the chance. This sight, when great Diomedes sought, his hair stood up on end, and him whom all the skill and power of arms did late attend. Now like a man in counsel poor, the travelling goes amiss, having passed a boundless plain, not knowing where he is, comes on the sudden, where he sees a river rough and raves, with his own billows ravished into the kings of waves, murmurs with foam and frights him back. So he, amazed, retired, and thus would make good his amaze. O friends, we all admired great Hector, as one of himself, well darting bold in war, when some god guards him still from death, and makes him dare so far. Now Mars himself, formed like a man, is present in his rage, and therefore whatsoever cause importunes you to wage war with these Trojans, never strive, but gently take your rod, lest in your bosoms for a man ye ever find a god. As Greeks retired, the power of Troy did much more forward please. And Hector, two brave men of war, sent to the fields of peace Menestheus and Anchialus. One chariot bare them both. Their falls made Ajax Telamon ruthful of heart and wrath, who lightened out a lance that smote on fierce as Selages, that dwelt in Pisos, rich in lands, and did huge gods possess. But fate to Priam and his sons conducted this supply. The javelin in his girdle struck and pierced mortal eye. His belly's lower part he fell, his arms had looked so trim, that Ajax needs would prove their spoil. The Trojans poured on him whole storms of lances large and sharp, of which a number stuck in his rough shield. Yet from the slain he did his javelin pluck, but could not from his shoulders force. The arms he did affect, the Trojans with such drifts of darts the body did protect, and wisely Telamonius feared their valorous defence. So many and so strong of hand stood in with such expense of deadly prowess, who repelled the big, strong, bold he were, the famous Ajax, and their friend did from his rapture bear. Thus this place, filled with strength of fight in the army's other prees, Tlepolemus, a tall big man, the son of Hercules, a cruel destiny inspired with strong desire to prove and counter with Sarpedon's strength, the son of cloudy Jove, who coming on to that stern end had chosen him his foe. Thus Jove's great nephew and his son gainst another go. Tlepolemus, to make his end more worth the will of fate, began as if he had her power, and showed the mortal state of too much confidence in man. With his superfluous brave, Sarpedon, what necessity on neither's humour drave thy form to these wars, which in her heart I know thou dost abhor, a man not seen in deeds of arms, a Lycian counsellor. They lie that call thee son to Jove, since Jove bred none so late. The men of elder times were they that his high power begat. Such men as had Herculean force. My father Hercules was Jove's true issue. He was bold, his deeds did well express. They sprung out of a lion's heart. He whilom came to Troy. For horse that Jupiter gave Tros, Ganymede, his boy, 6 ships only, and few men, tore the city down, left all her broad ways desolate, and made his horse his own. For thee, thy mind is ill disposed, thy body's powers are poor, and therefore are thy troops so weak, and soldiers evermore follows the temper of his chief. And thou pult'st down aside, but say thou art the son of Jove, and hast thy means supplied with forces fitting his descent. The powers that I compel shall throw thee hence, and make thy head run ope the gates of hell. Jove's the saying issue, answered him Tlepolemus, 'tis true. Thy father, holy Ilion, in that sort overthrew. The injustice of the king was caused that, where thy father had used good deservings to his state, he quitted him with bad. Hesione, the joy and grace of King Laomedon, thy father rescued from a whale and gave to Telamon in honoured nuptials. Telamon, whom his strongest Greek boasts to have issued, and this grace might well expect alike. Yet he gave taunts for thanks, and kept against his oath his horse, and therefore both thy father's strength and justice might enforce the wreck he took on Troy. But this, and thy cause differ far. Sons seldom heir their father's worth. Thou canst not make his war. What thou assumed for him is mine, to be on thee imposed. With this he threw an ashen dart, and then Tlepolemus loosed another from his glorious hand. Both at one instant flew. Both struck, both wounded. From his neck Sarpedon's javelin drew, the lifeblood of Tlepolemus. Full in the midst it fell, and what he threatened the other gave, the darkness and that hell. Sarpedon's left thigh took the lance, pierced the solid bone, and with his raging head ran through, but Jove preserved this son. The dart yet vexed him bitterly, which should have pulled him out. But none considered then so much, so thick came on the rout, and filled each hand so full of cause to ply his own defence. 'Twas held enough, both fallen that both were nobly carried thence. Ulysses knew the events of both, and took it from to heart, that his friend's enemy should scape, and in a twofold part his thoughts contended if he should pursue Sarpedon's life, or take his friend's wreck on his men. Fate did conclude this strife, by whom 'twas otherwise decreed then that Ulysses' steel should end Sarpedon. In this doubt Minerva took the wheel from fickle chance, and then made his mind resolve to right his friends with that blood he could surest draw. Then revenge did extend her full power on the multitude. Then did he never miss Alastor, Halius, Chromius, Nemon, Prytanis, Alcander, and a number more he slew, and more had slain, if Hector had not understood whose power of men in a main, and struck fear through the Grecian troops, but to Sarpedon gave hope of full rescue, who thus cried, O Hector, help and save my body from the spoil of Greece, that to your loved town my friends may see me born, and then let earth possess her own. This soil, for whose sake I left my countries for no day, shall ever show me that again to my wife display, and young hope of my name, the joy of my much thirsted sight, all which I left for Troy. For them let Troy then do this right. To all this Hector gave no word, but greedily he strives with all his speed to repel the Greeks, shed in floods their lives, and left Sarpedon. But what face Shuva he put on the following, the common cause, he left the prince alone. For his particular grudge, because so late he was so plain in his reproof before the host, and that did he retain, however, for example's sake, he would not show it then, for his shame too, since 'twas just, but good Sarpedon's men ventured themselves, and forced him off, and set him underneath the goodly beach of Jupiter, while now they did unsheath the ashen lance strong Pelagon, his friend, most loved, most true, and forced it from the maimed thigh, with which his spirits flew, and darkness overflew his eyes. Yet with a gentle gale, round about the dying prince, cool Boreas did exhale. He was revived, recomforted, that else had grieved and died. All this time, flight drave to the fleet the Argives who applied no weapon gainst the proud pursuit, nor ever turned ahead. They knew so well that Mars pursued, and dreadful Hector led. Then who was first, who last, whose lives the iron Mars did seize, and Priam's Hector, Helenus, surnamed Enipides, good Teuthras and Doristes, skilled in managing of horse, bold Enamos, and a man renowned for martial force, Trecus, the great Aetolian chief, Oresbius, that did wear the gaudy mitre, studied with wealth extremely, and dwelt near the Atlantic lake, Cephisides, in Hela, by whose seat the god of men of Boeotia dwelt. This slaughter grew so great, it flew to heaven. Saturnia discerned it, and cried out to Pallas, O unworthy sight, to see a field so fought, and break her words to Sparta's king, that Ilion might be razed. And he returned revenged, when thus we see his Greeks disgraced, and bear the harmful rage of Mars. Come, let us use our care, that we dishonour not our powers, Minerva as yere. She had the despite of Troy. Her golden girdled steeds, then Saturn's daughter, brought abroad, and Hebe then proceeds to dress her chariot instantly. She gives it either wheel, beamed with 8 spokes of sounding brass. The axle tree was steel, the felfs incorruptible gold, the upper bands of brass. Their master, the matter most unvalued, Their works of wondrous grace. The naves in which the spokes were driven were all with silver bound. The chariot seat, two hopes of gold and silver strength were round. Edged with a gold and silver fringe, the beam that looked before was massy silver, on whose top gales of gold wore, and golden poitrels Juno mounts, and her hot horses reigned, that thirsted for contention, and still of peace complained. Minerva wrapped in her robe, that curiously she wove, with glorious colours as she sate, and the azure floor of Jove, and wore the arms that he puts on, bent the tearful field. About her broad spread shoulders hung his huge and horrid shield, fringed round with ever-fighting snakes. Through it was drawn to life the miseries and deaths of fight. In it frowned bloody strife. In it shined sacred fortitude. In it fell pursuit flew. In it monster Gorgon's head, in which held out to view were all the dire ostents of Jove. On her big head she placed this four-plumed, glittering casque of gold, so admirably vast, it would 100 garrisons of soldiers comprehend. Then to her shining chariot her vigorous feet ascend, and in her violent hand she takes his grave, huge, solid lance, with which the conquests of her womb she uses to advance, and overturn whole fields of men, to show she was the seed of him that thunders. Then heaven's queen, to urge her horses' speed, takes up the scourge, and forth they fly. The ample gates of heaven rung and flew open of themselves, the charge whereof is given, with all Olympus and the sky, to the distinguished hours, that clear or hard it all in clouds, and pour it down in showers. This way their scourge-obeying horse made haste, and soon they won the top of all the topful heavens. At what aged Saturn's son sat severed from other gods, then stayed the white-armed queen, her steeds, and asked of Jove if Mars did not incense his spleen with his foul deeds, in ruining so many and so great in the command of Greece, and in so rude a heat, at which she said Apollo laughed, and Venus, who still sue to that mad god for violence that never justice knew, for whose impiety she asked if with his wished love herself might free the field of him. He bade her rather move. Athenia to the charge she sought, with used of old to be the bane of Mars, and had as well the gift of spoil as he. This grace she slacked not, but her horse scourged that in nature flew betwixt the cope of stars and earth, and how afar out of view a man into the purple sea may from a hill descry, so far a high neighing horse of heaven at every jump would fly. Arrived at Troy, where broken curls the two floods mixed their force, Scamander and bright Simois, Saturnia stayed her horse, took them from chariot, and a cloud of mighty depth diffused about them, and the verdant banks of Simois produced in nature what they eat in heaven. Then both the goddesses marched like a pair of timorous doves, in hasting their access to the Argive succour. Being arrived where both the most and best were heaped together, showing all like lions at a feast, of new-slain carcasses, of boars beyond an encounter strong. There found they Diomedes, and there, midst all the admiring throng, Saturnia put on Stentor's shape, that had a brazen voice, and spake as loud as 50 men, like whom she made a noise, and chid the Argives, O ye Greeks, in name and outward right, but princes only, not in act, with scandal and what despite. Use ye to honour all this time the great Iliad, whose conversant in arms your foes durst not a foot address. Without their port so much they feared his lance that all controlled, and now they outrage to your fleet. This did with shame make bold the general spirit of the power of the Greeks, when, with the particular note of their disgrace, Athenia made Tydeus' issue hot. She found him at his chariot, refreshing of his wound inflicted by the slain Pandarus. His sweat did so abound, it much annoyed him underneath the broad belt of his shield, with which, tired with his toil, his soul could hardly yield his body motion. With his hand he lifted up the belt, and whipped away that clotted blood. The fervent wound did melt. Minerva leaned against his horse, and near their withers laid her sacred hand, then spake to him, Believe me, Diomedes, Tydeus exampled not himself, and be his son not great, but yet he was a soldier, a man of so much heat, that in his embassy for Thebes, when I forbade his mind to be too venturous when the feasts his heart might have declined, with which they welcomed him, he made a challenge to the best, and foiled the best. I've given aid, because the rust of rest, that would have seized another mind he suffered not, but used the trial I made like a man, and there sought feasts refused. Yet when I set thee on, thou faintest. Guard thee, charge, exhort, that I, abetting thee, thou shouldst be to the Greeks a fort and a dismay to Ilion, yet thou obeyedst in naught, afraid or slothful, or else both. Henceforth renounce all thought that ever thou wert Tydeus' son. He answered her, I know. Thou art Jove's daughter, and for that in all just duty thy speech is reverence, yet affirm ingeniously that fear doth neither hold me spiritless nor sloth. I only bear thy charge in zealous memory, that I should never war with any blessed deity, unless exceeding far the limits of a rule, the queen that governs chamber sport should press to field, and her they will. Enjoyed my lance to hurt, but he whose power hath right in arms, I knew in person here, besides the Cyprian deity, and therefore did forbear. And here have gathered in retreat these other Greeks you see, with note and reverence of your charge, my dearest mine, said she. What then was fit its change? 'Tis true, Mars hath just rule in war, but just war. Otherwise he raves, not fights. He's altered far. He vowed to Juno and myself that his aid should be used against the Trojans, whom it guards, and therein he abused his rule in arms, infringed his word, and made his war unjust. He is inconstant, impious, mad. Resolve then, firmly trust my aid of thee against the worst or any deity. Add scourge to thy free horse, charge whom he fights perfidiously. This said, as that brave king, her knight, with his horse guiding friend, was set before the chariot for sign he should descend. That she might serve for wagoness, she plucked the wagoner back, and up into his seat she mounts. The beechen tree did crack beneath the burthen on good cause. It bore so huge a thing, a goddess so replete with power, and such a puissant king. She snatched the scourge up and in the reins, and shut her heavenly look in hell's vast helm of Mars's eyes, and full career she took at him, who then had newly slain the mighty Pyraphas, renowned son to Ochesius, and far the strongest was of all the Aetolians, to whose spoil the bloody god was run. But when this man-plague saw the approach of godlike Tydeus the son, he let his mighty Pyraphas lie, and in full charge he ran at Diomedes, and he ran at him in turn. Not both near the god began, and thirsty of his blood, he drove a brazen lance that bears full on the breast of Diomedes, that above the reins and gears, but Pallas took it on her hand, and struck the eager lance beneath the chariot. Then the knight of Pallas doth advance, and the cast of a javelin off at Mars Minerva sent it on. That where his arming girdle gilt, his belly grazed upon, just at the rim, and wranched the flesh. The lance again he got, but left the wound that stung him so. He laid out such a throat, as if 9,000 or 10,000 men had brayed out of all their breasts in one confusion. Having felt as many sudden deaths, the roar made both the hosts amazed. Up flew the god to heaven, and with him was through all the air as black as tincture driven, to Diomedes' eyes as when the earth half choked with smoking heat, of clumsy clouds that strife men, and pitchy tempests threat, ushered with horrid gusts of wind, with such bleak vapours plumed, Mars flute to Olympus, and broad heaven, and there his place resumed. Sadly he went on sapped by Jove, and showed his immortal blood. But from a mortal man-made wound poured such an impious flood, and weeping poured out these complaints, O Father, storm'st thou not to see us take the wrong from men? Extreme briefs we have got, even by our own deep councils held for gratifying them, and thou, our council's president, concludest in this extreme of fighting ever bare, being ruled by one that thus has bred, one never well, but doing ill, a girl so full of head, that through all other gods obey, her mad moods must command, and thy indulgence, nor by word, nor any touch of hand, correcting her, thy reason is, she is a spark of thee, and therefore she may kindle rage in men against gods, and she may make men hurt gods, and those gods that are besides thy seed. First in the palms hit Cyprides, then runs the impious deed on my hurt person, and could life give way to death in me, or had my feet not fetched me off, heaps up mortality, had kept me on concert, Jupiter with a contracted brow, thus Answered Mars, thou many minds in constant challenge, and thou sit not complaining thus by me, who most of all the gods, inhabiting the starry hill, I hate no periods, being set to thy contentions, brawls, fights, and pitching fields, just of thy mother Juno's moods, stiff-necked and never yields, though I correct her still and chide, nor can forbear offence, though to her son, this wound I know, tastes of her insolence. But I will prove more natural, thou shouldst be cured, because thou comest of me. Thou hadst thou been so cross to sacred laws, being born to any other god, thou hadst been thrown from heaven, long since as low as Tartarus, beneath the giants driven. This said, he gave his wound in charge to Paeon, who applied such sovereign medicines, that as soon the pain was qualified, and he procured as nourishing milk when runnet is put in, runs all in heaps, of tuck thick curd, through in his nature thin. Even so, soon his wound-parted sides ran close in his recure, for he, all deathless, could not long the parts of death endure. Then Hebe bathed and put on him fresh garments, and he sate, exulting by his sire again on top of all his state. So, having from the spoils of men made his desire remove, Juno and Pallas reascend the starry court to Jove.